and how to kind of quantify those things. The other hat that I wear is that I run a company that got its beginnings developing training programs for endurance athletes. And using the techniques that I'm going to tell you about today, we got a lot of really, really good results. I have no background myself in elite sport. I was briefly a college volleyball player, and I lasted a year at that. But I'm really good at math, it turns out. And I never thought I would say that out loud. But it turns out that I was able to develop some tools and use some pre-existing tools to get really great performances out of some endurance athletes. And believe me, no one's more surprised than me that this works. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that today. So how did I get involved with this hoser from Canada? You know, we met on the internet. It's weirder than it sounds. But before I knew it, I was teaching courses with this guy at MIT, and really Dave's turned out to be one of the best colleagues I've ever had, and it's a real pleasure to come here and do this with him. And so, in light, trying to get a little bit of cultural exchange going on, I spent a long time calling Dave a hoser, and then I learned that it's actually a real term, and it's not just from the Mackenzies, and so I just put that out there because Dave didn't know what this was either until I told him yesterday. So. It was exciting. So one of the things that I stole this slide from Dave's very first talk at MIT that we did together, because what I like to think of what I do as performance engineering. I'm using mathematical tools to develop physiological systems to get desired outcomes. And it's a very, data goes in this end, performance comes out that end, and then we can tweak things to get the kind of outcomes that we want. And again, my athletes over a period of about 6 or 7 years got a half dozen world championships and a world record among them. Some Olympic medals and things like that. Other people have used these techniques, so it's pretty cool. Those are two of the athletes that are among my favorite stories. On the left is Kat Morrison. She's from Scotland. She's a 4-time world champion in duathlon. On the right side, that's Joanna Zeiger, previously an Olympian for the U.S., the first female Olympian for triathlon. At age 38 in 2008, she won the half Ironman World Championships with a world record. I'm going to show you her data here today because it's fun to look at. Because it really shows you the possibilities here. Now, all these techniques are dependent upon these wearable devices. And really what we're talking about here is the problem we see, the problem as I see it in the field, which is that we have lots and lots and lots of devices, but the analytics are way behind. And anyone who's goofed around with Catapult or any similar systems can see that. That really we can collect all kinds of data, but who's really understands how to use it? And so I'm going to try and flesh that out for you a little bit today. But the idea is that it's not the miles that you cover, it's not the number of reps you do in the gym or whatever, it's the physiological impact of those things that makes all the difference. So training metrics I really divide into two separate things. Do we want to know about training and the impact over time, or do we want to know about the impact of what the athlete is doing right now? And we can do both things, but it's easy to conflate the two, and there are connections between the two. And so the basic thought process is simply this. We're going to develop this metric, this way of quantifying the training load on the athlete to look at longitudinal stuff. And that's due to the interaction of volume and intensity, and I'll explain that a little bit. We'll talk about quantifying performance capacity. What we need to do is see what the athlete can do before we can determine how that's going to change over time. We're going to understand the interaction between the two using something called impulse response modeling, which you already understand even though you don't think you do. And then finally, we'll talk about how we manage performance, how we look at fatigue, how we quantify fatigue, and how the athlete is going to perform during an event. So the first thing to think about is how do we determine training impact? And this is slightly more complicated than it sounds. Right? If you tell me, oh, I went out and ran 5 miles today, you really didn't tell me anything. Is 5 miles long for you? I don't know. How fast did you run it? Oh, I ran it at 8:30 pace. Is 8:30 pace fast for you? I have no idea. And so that's the first idea. Is what we want to understand is how much did you train, how long did you train, and how impactful was that training? And so what we do is we look at the minutes trained to get our duration or volume. We look at the fraction of critical power or some of the threshold that you maintain to get an intensity. And then we weight that based upon how intense it is, because we know there's a nonlinear effect of intensity on adaptation, right? We know that high-intensity interval training gets you way more bang for your buck than jogging around the block. And so we try to reflect that in these kind of numerical scores. And so we end up with a score that gives us a little bit of interesting information. Now, interestingly, this whole field starts with Eric Bannister from SFU. you know, in the 1970s and then later. He developed this thing called the training impulse score, and we just take the minutes we trained, multiply that by the average heart rate we held, and then weight that heart rate. And we put that weighting factor in because, like I said, it's a nonlinear relationship. And the easiest way to think about that is this. Most of us could probably run the 100 at 15 kilometers an hour. I'll bet none of us can do it at 30 miles an hour. So it's not just that it's twice as hard to go twice as fast. It's way harder to go that much faster. And so what we do is we want to reflect that mathematically. And the way Bannister did it was the easiest way possible at the time. He could plot lactate, he could plot heart rate, and he ends up, instead of thinking in terms of a linear relationship between VO2 and a maximal heart rate, he gets a curve that looks like this. Now, I'm not sure the difference between women and men is particularly meaningful, but the idea is simply that the harder we go, the closer we get to 1.0 or 100% of our maximum heart rate, we get on the y-axis a greater and greater multiplying factor. So by this math, we would say that if we're running at 100% of our maximum heart rate, the impact factor is maybe 5.5 times baseline. Does that make good sense? Okay. But we can do a similar thing with power, right? So the dark black line, the light gray line is the sort of power a cyclist is outputting. This is a smoothed plot, so you can understand it more easily. And the dark line is sort of the physiological cost incurred. And so what you can end up seeing here is that at low power outputs, the two are relatively well matched. But if you really start hitting it, if you really start going above the critical power, you can see that there's much more impact from those periods of those high power outputs on the physiology than you might expect from the power output all by itself. Now, one of the reasons we like to use power output in particular is that heart rate data is not necessarily the most reliable thing in the world. If it's hot, your heart rate is higher. If you get poor sleep, your heart rate is higher. If you're overtrained, it might be lower. And so it's not necessarily the best reflection of external workload, whereas power can be a little bit better than that. And this is from something, from an abstract I put out in 2006, where I developed a way of calculating power output for runners, and then took myself out and ran the same run at the same pace on 3 different days at widely different temperatures over the period of 2 weeks. And what we found is, just over, while the one metric always gives us the same value because it was run at the same pace on the same course, the heart rate-based metric gives us a much higher number. So that may not necessarily be reflective of the training impact of the session. Now, there is some data out now that suggests there is a greater impact from training done in the heat. In my opinion, those data still need to be replicated. But it's something to think about moving forward. But once you calculate these scores, you can do interesting things. For example, this is some of Kat Morrison's data. And on a day-to-day basis, we can look at her training loads over different sports in a stacked plot and kind of look at where her stress is coming from in a sort of a macro sense. But more interestingly, we can then look at her training load from the point of view of both the power and that kind of intensity-corrected power. So we can look at these things and say, okay, if the dark blue is her average power output and the green is the sort of intensity-corrected or normalized power output, we can start to understand a little bit more about how she's training. For instance, down here, when she's sort of tapering a bit, you can see that the normalized numbers are quite high, reflecting the interval training that she's doing in preparation for a race, while the average powers are somewhat lower than that. So again, it's a nice way of getting a broad picture of what's going on with your athlete. So to kind of summarize for the time being, these training stress metrics, of which there are a lot, they're all good ways that to analyze training that take into account both intensity and duration, which is what we're interested about. And so we can tell a little bit of something about the physiological impact of different types of workouts, and you can directly compare workouts. You can say, okay, how much training stress came from this interval workout versus this steady state workout versus this long duration workout. Important for me in constructing the training of a multi-sport athlete. Now this is helpful, but it's not sort of the really important part. Because what we need to do is understand the relationship between training and performance. So we need to track some effort, some test effort, to know if the athlete's getting better or not. As I always tell my athletes, the time to find out you were not prepared is not the day of the race. You want to know this well in advance so we can do something about it. And that's why my athletes are all tested on a regular basis. So for example, this is an amateur triathlete doing a 20-minute sort of all-out test on the bike. And we can see over the period of several months how his average power improves and then kind of plateaus. Now remember this picture, I'm going to take it back to you, we're going to come back to it, or that data in particular, in a minute. Because once we have training and performance data, we can use something called the Bannister model, again, from Simon Fraser. And it's a really simple model, right? How well you do is equal to how fit you are minus how tired you are. Now, that looks ridiculously simple, but that's really all it is. As I explain the more complicated math to you, never let this equation leave your mind. So let's think about some of the things we know about fitness and fatigue and the way it comes and goes, okay? So we know that fitness and fatigue increase immediately with training, and differently. If I go out and run 10K today as hard as I can, I've got both more fit and more tired. If I do it again tomorrow, will I be faster or slower? Why am I going to be slower? Right, because I'm tired, but I'm also more fit, right? So what I'm saying is that I got more fit than I did, or more tired than I did fit in the short term. And the next thing we say is that both this fitness and fatigue we've gotten decay afterwards. And we say exponentially because that's how most body processes work. And then we say that fatigue has a shorter half-life than fitness. It decays faster. That's why we get better over time. If I run my 10K as hard as I can today, and I rest a few days, and I try it again, once the fatigue load has dropped, I will be faster. And so we make the equation reflect that. And then finally, we have to do a little bit of calculus. We have to add these things up over time. My fitness today is equal to what my fitness was yesterday, minus the little bit I lost overnight, plus whatever I do today. And the same with fatigue. I go out and exercise hard today. I incur a certain fatigue score. It gets a little better overnight. As I sleep, I wake up, I train again, I gather more. So if you look here, the yellow curve is the relative performance, blue is the fitness, pink is the fatigue. And so this is just a single episode of training. So the first thing that happens is that fatigue goes up faster than fitness does, leading to a decrease in performance. So if I train again here, or try to race again here, I'm going to be worse than I was before. But if I wait a little while, the fatigue scores drop, the fitness scores remain slightly higher, and then performance will eventually reach a peak if I wait long enough. And all we're saying in terms of this calculus bit is that we're looking at the sum of the fitness and the fatigue, right? So you have constants that tell you the difference in the spread. How much more did your fatigue rise than your fitness did? And then you have these decay constants. How quick does one leave versus the other? So what we end up doing is this hairy thing. But this is not complicated. All I'm saying is that how well you perform is equal to the sum of your fitness minus your fatigue over time. So we just add it up all the way into the past and come up with whatever the sum of those things are today. So I train today, I get a little fatigued, my fatigue drops. I train again, the new level is equal to wherever I was plus what I do today. Does that make sense? So over time, this just goes back into infinity. But what we do is we then educate this model. Remember those performances I showed you before? We throw those into the model. And we say, computer, adjust all these constants until the performances match the performances I know the athlete actually did. And then we get a model of our athlete. And now we understand how their performance is related to their training. So what you end up with, you can see here, same data I showed you earlier. Green is what the computer thinks they should be able to do. The dark dots are what the athlete actually did. You can see those are very, very nice predictions. Very, very close to reality. And that's very helpful if you're trying to guide an athlete towards a peak performance at a big race. So earlier I promised to show you some of Joanna's data from her World Championship season. And this is what we did. We used this model, we calibrated it to her, and then built the training. Each one of these arrows represents either a win or a personal best. And you can see that they each correlate with a peak in the green performance curve. Add training, taper a little bit, make sure she gets a new peak, and then repeat throughout the season. Until finally up here, we hit her biggest peak where she sets a personal best or world record in a world championship at age 38. Not bad. I'd love to tell you this is because I'm some kind of like secret guru coach and you should pay me $1 million to go out and coach a professional team to do something. All I can do is use Microsoft Excel and successfully communicate with an athlete. And it really is that simple, particularly things like this, which are not particularly skill-based. It's a matter of, it's almost a pure test of fitness. But this not only works for elite athletes, it works for, kind of overweight doctors from Chicago. This data, you can see just, for me, it fits just as well. This is an ill-advised trip to Colorado for ACSM. Rode up to Golden a couple times, got a huge fatigue load, but after not being able to train for a few days, being totally shredded, I was able to go out and have a couple of really good races. So again, this was really my first test of the model, and again, no one was more surprised than me that it worked. But the cool thing is that this doesn't just work in athletic settings. Like I said, I work with a lot of athletes who are injured in my medical practice, and guess what? Rehab from ACL, I can model that too. In this case, we had the athlete do an 800-meter walk around a track throughout his recovery. And we can see that we can very nicely predict how they're going to do. Here's another, this is an athlete who was in a bad crash, had some surgery, and then, just again, testing him throughout his recovery and rebuilding his training. And again, we get a very nice prediction of what's going on with this guy. But we can also have what I call the come to Jesus talk. This is where athletes try things they think are going to work and they don't work. And I can say, we tried it your way, now let's try it my way. And so here's a athlete who went off to do an epic, quote-unquote epic camp in Hawaii, where he put in like 500 miles in 3 days or something on his bike. So you can see this blue line slowly rising, 10% rise, per week is not unreasonable. You can see he does something totally insane here and ends up sick and overreached and isn't able to train for a while, and then we start training him again here. But what I would always show people is this. This is the rate we were going, and we ended up on that same trajectory afterwards. So in the end of the day, this ridiculous camp did nothing except keep you from training for 2 weeks. So again, useful for the come to Jesus talk. But kind of the cool thing is that once you've got this model, which is reflective of the athlete, we can figure out some other things. For example, we can calculate these things called influence curves. We take the parameters from the model and do some funny stuff to them. And what we end up doing is figuring out a couple of things. Number one, how much training for better or worse will training today have on my event sometime in the future? Or alternatively, how long will it take me to see a positive impact of performance from the training that I did today? And what you do is essentially read the same curve backwards. So the way this curve should be read is this. Day 0 is the day of your event, and this is how much effect, for better or worse, training has on you. And so what you see here is that as you get closer to the event, training gets more important until it's not so important anymore. The reason why is in this area you have to start shedding your fatigue, otherwise you're going to not do as well as you oughta. And what you see here are two very different curves. This is Joanna Zeiger, age 38. This is Kat Morrison, age 33. Both have almost identical critical power. Both have an identical VO2 max. In a squad situation, the average coach would have trained these athletes the same way. Yet you can see that these two people need to have their training built in a fundamentally different way. Joanna needs a much slower build than Kat does. Kat, we can ramp her right up, taper her for 3 days, and she's ready to crush it. If I try that with Joanna, she's going to be way down here someplace. All that training is going to add too much fatigue, and she's not going to perform well. Looking at this curve, the very first thing I did to Joanna when she came to me was cut her training load in half. She thought I was out of my mind. Then she had the best season of her life. So what we need to do is find these ways of customizing training to where the athlete responds. But the other interesting bit of this is that in different sports, the same athlete will have a different response. So if you're thinking about, say, a soccer player who's doing gym work and endurance work and sprint work and ball handling and all that kind of things, all these kind of different things, the fitness and fatigue and their ability to perform comes and goes differently. So for this example, we see that this sport needs to be tapered faster than this one, which is faster than this one, and each should be built differently. So this is important to not program athletes too simplistically. It doesn't all work the same way. Different sports, different modalities have different effects. You can also think about this in terms of training for, planning for different kind of events. If we've got one event here and one event here, and we draw that influence curve for each event, what we find is this. If I start tapering for this event here, I'm tapering during the most important training period for the second event. How do we rob Peter to pay Paul here? Because we don't want anyone to be too tired, but we also don't want to give up on training for different events. So you have to kind of use these models in a little bit of a holistic way, divide things out, and then figure out what the best way of doing it is. Now, typically, people have had to kind of just dope this out on their own, but mathematically, there are ways of trying to figure it out, which is helpful. So the next thing to think about in the last bit of this talk is what I talked about earlier, this idea of session metrics. What can the athlete do now? How are they going to get fatigued during an event? and what can we do to help them with that? And so it all goes back to A.V. Hill, right, in the early part of the 20th century, who goes out, plots world records of different sports, and then realizes that there is this curvilinear relationship between how hard you can do something and how long you can do it for. And here it is from the original 1924 paper, and he looks at swimming and running and things like that for men and women. But you see, for a short period of time, they can go real fast, and then the curve kind of flattens out over time, right? This is sort of the first representation of something called threshold. We can do something out here for a long time, but as soon as we go above a certain level, the time we can do it shortens dramatically. And so here's a paper from our lab back in Exeter from 2010. This is the critical power model. And the idea is simply this. If I go out and make you run 1K real hard, 2K real hard, 3K real hard, and so on, I can draw a curve, which has two interesting characteristics. Number one, it levels out, right? That is sort of the idea of the quote-unquote threshold athletes think they feel. It's also a physiological threshold, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the other interesting thing is this. This area under the curve is always the same. You can think of it like a battery. Once I cross this quote-unquote critical power or threshold or whatever you want to call it, I have a limited amount of energy available to me. I can use it fast by going real hard, or I can use it slow by going a little bit easier. But in either case, the battery does not change size. I've got a limited amount of energy available to me, and I have to guard it jealously if I want to have a good event. So, if we cross the critical power, interesting things happen. If we're down here doing moderate exercise, so below lactate threshold, below 1 millimole lactate, what we find is that VO2 rises and then levels out. Lactate stays steady. If I cross the lactate threshold, we end up in what's called the heavy domain. What happens here is that lactate rises and then ends up a little bit higher than you might expect. VO2 rises, and then you see a second bump, the slow component of VO2 you may have heard about in class. And then finally, in the severe domain, above the critical power, we end up with a continually rising lactate, a continually rising VO2 until such a time as we're not able to continue exercising anymore. So what we're talking about here is what the earliest physiologists, A.V. Hill et al., called the difference between stable and unstable physiology. If I go any harder than this particular effort level, things go bad wrong. And we know that from MRI studies done in our lab. If we exercise athletes below critical power, 10% below, we see consistent levels of creatine phosphate, of inorganic phosphate, and of pH. If we put them 10% above the critical power, we see creatine phosphate drop, inorganic phosphate rise, and pH drop precipitously until we reach some kind of limiting values, and the muscle's really upset, and then we're forced to stop exercising. So the nice thing about this is that it's a bona fide physiological threshold that we can reflect with mathematics to try and figure out what's going on with the athlete. And so the model framework works like this. How much you've got left in the tank, this thing called W prime or work prime, is equal to how much you started with minus the sum of everything you've used, which recovers when you drop below critical power with a characteristic time course. Or, when I was teaching in England, I found that everyone worked better in terms of beer. How sober you are is equal to how sober you were to start with minus all the beer you drink, each of which is slowly being peed out. So, if I drink a beer now and wait half an hour, roughly how much beer is left in me? About half a beer, right? If we believe alcohol kinetics. So if I drink another beer at half an hour, how many beers do I have in me now? Right? Beer and a half. And so on. This is the process that should be going on in your brain. Don't worry about the calculus and the nonsense. Think in terms of something that's easy to understand. So the study we did was we went out and did intervals above the critical power and below, and then we asked the computer, using that model, solve the model so that we end up with 0 left in the tank at the time the athlete fatigued. Or if you prefer to think about it, because some people like to think rather than draining a tank, they think about accumulating some fatigue-inducing metabolite, you just reverse the sign on the equation and you can think of it that way too. Either way, it's the same thing. But what's interesting is this. What we find is that how fast you recover is dependent upon how easy you go. The easier you're able to recover, the faster you refill the tank. And so we're now able to go out and plot for different athletes and figure out, for example, for a marathon runner, how many times can this guy surge before he's going to empty his tank? How many times, or how many times can a cyclist afford to chase a break? And so on. So it becomes very, very useful. But like I said, this model reflects physiology. If we look at the change in how much W prime there is, and we look at the change in VO2, there's a linear relationship between the two. Right? It's going towards VO2. The VO2 is trending towards max. The tank is trending towards empty. The two are intimately correlated. But in recovery, they're correlated as well. If I look at recovery of the model and recovery of creatine phosphate in the model, or recovery of creatine phosphate in the MRI, we find the two, again, are correlated. So it's nice that our math reflects what's going on inside the muscle. You know, an MRI machine costs about $10 million. You know, we can do this with a stopwatch. So that's pretty cool. So we later showed that this model works in the field. So we looked at athletes when they were tired, when they were not tired, when they were exhausted, et cetera, and found that, indeed, most athletes punk out about the time what's left in the tank is predicted to hit zero, which again is a pretty cool result. But then we can make plots like this, where we can actually help educate athletes. So here's an athlete who goes out riding with his buddies. They do a bunch of intervals. He empties the tank about halfway, and then he gets some recovery in, and then he makes an ill-advised attack. And you can see here, trends down, 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 empties the tank, hits zero, throws up in the bushes, and then is kind of forced to kind of lollygag at home. You know, but we can also look at athletes' workouts. For example, here's the training plan I put out for a particular elite athlete. So we do these nice intervals, the tank drops down, 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 but we never hit zero. Now I send the athlete out into the world, go do this workout. They do a couple intervals, they decide these are too easy, they try and go harder, they empty the tank, and they never finish the workout. So again, it's a good educational tool to go back to the athlete and say, see what happened here? Don't do that again. Because there are particular perceptual cues that go along with having the tank drained to different levels. Athletes learn their bodies a little bit better. They learn how to figure out when they're really going to blow up and when they're not. We can also go back and look at different types of races. This is an elite triathlete. Went out, did a relatively flat triathlon, but on the bike, like what we see are these big spikes. He's sprinting out of corners, he's doing stupid things, he drains the tank, he gets off the bike at zero, and now he can't run. Bad day. Here, the next week, in fact, we send him out on a different race, and we give him some guidelines. Don't spike higher than this. Don't make this more than this many surges. And again, he drains down, he ends up with about the tank half full, has a great race, and wins. So again, a really good analysis tool to go back and figure out what to do with people. But again, this works for anything. If you're interested in human health, you can plot these kind of curves for an old guy who's trying to get to the mailbox and he's got heart failure. You know, the models all still work. It's not just for athletes. And so this is really important when you start thinking about these new consumer devices and things. When we think about how we want to manage patients in the field, we can start giving them better advice how to divide up their activities of daily living, for example. So there's lots of different ways to do this. I like this one because it shows basically perfect execution. This is Katrina Morrison winning the 2010 World Championships in duathlon in Edinburgh, Scotland. And it's a little bit of a busy slide. In black, you see altitude. So that's her going over this Arthur's Seat, the same climb again in Edinburgh. Yellow is the power output. And then purple is what's left in the tank. And you can see here that she kind of goes down. She hangs loose for a little bit, and then she makes her first big attack going up the climb. And she doesn't quite empty the tank, but she gets close. She knows when to pull back. Again, she recovers. Now it's just her and one competitor. And she's able to break her and then end up coming in all by herself, 1 minute and 30 seconds in the lead. And she jogs it in for a win. So again, we were able to use this model in advance on the course and then decide what the best strategy was going to be for her, physiologically speaking. So that was pretty cool. So in terms of sort of more recent developments, there's a guy called Nate Townsend here in the audience. He and one of his students did a really cool study that I was lucky enough to be part of, where they looked at, for example, an important question. What about hypoxia? How does this model work? If I want to use this on a Tour de France cyclist who's going to try and go up Alpe d'Huez, right, does that work? And it turns out you got to make some very careful adjustments. So if I run the model in normoxia, it works fine. If I try and use those same model parameters in hypoxia, it doesn't work at all. But if I adjust it such that we measure the critical power in W prime at altitude, and run the model, again, it works fine. So either you need to adapt the model to account for changes in critical power with altitude, or you need to go ahead and measure what happens at different altitudes for your athlete. But again, it would be a robust change to the model. Another sort of interesting study I was part of with Brockstrom last year, they used hand grip exercise, because it's easy to do, and what they looked at was the difference in duty cycle. So we basically do exercise with a fixed cadence, but either we just squeeze for 20% of the time, or we squeeze for 50% of the time and then release. And what we find is that on a shorter duty cycle, by squeezing a shorter period of time, you recover a little bit faster. So if you track this model all the way out, you last longer on the shorter duty cycle. Now this should make you start thinking, what does this mean for, say, cyclists at a low cadence versus a high cadence, for example? And so there's all these cool things we can now do, that we can now measure what's going on with the athlete on sort of a second-by-second basis during exercise. So just throw a couple of concluding remarks at you. We can tell these clinical use cases as well. When will a patient in physical therapy be ready for discharge? When will they be back at where they ought to be? How fast can my heart failure patient walk without becoming fatigued? How can we optimize cardiac rehab? Actually, this study has already been done. Back, I think it was in the 90s. People used this model and looked at building up a cardiac rehab program. How much benefit does a patient realize from a particular intervention? All these things can be easily quantified now, and then you can make decisions how you want to do things. So devices and data have advanced quickly, but however, it's only just now that we're getting into the kind of analytics that we need. With those analytics, life-changing insights are possible. All these athletes had these wins they would never have gotten. Athletes in rehab, now we can figure out when they're going to get back sooner, or just, mom or dad who needs to know when they're going to be able to get back to their kid's soccer game. So it's powerful stuff. Just in closing, I already thanked Dave. I got to thank all these guys from the Jones Lab in Exeter who were nice enough to welcome me for 3 years before the 2012 games, where I got to develop all this math to do these different things, which is very cool. And again, to thank Dave, because he was my most important colleague in developing all this stuff. If you have quantitative problems, he's the guy to call. He's very, very good at what he does. Those are a gazillion references. I think we're going to take questions later. Thank you for your attention.
So when I think about modeling, when we talk about modeling, what are we generally talking about here? We're usually thinking about there's this black box. Here's this black box where something happens, and you need to have some some input into this black box, and it does something that it generates an output which predicts some sort of output, some metrics that you're interested in. And usually for the inputs, at least in team sports that I'm involved in rugby sevens, that we're really interested in some training load. We're inputting some training load that is coming either from internal or external measured metrics. We quantify the fatigue and fitness that Phil talked about for the Bannister model. And for the output, we need some performance tests to somehow recalibrate that model in order to make a accurate prediction, right? So before we go into the models, I want to just give you guys a grasp, just to give you a sense of what kind of data that the team captures in both in rugby sevens and also in soccer that I'm working with. We collect data from every athlete. They wear this GPS tracking device on the field for every practice session and every game session, game that they play. So this device tracks about 88 variables at 100 times a second. So you can imagine the amount of data that we're generating here. Okay, for a rugby game, that's roughly around 15 to 20 minutes. Talking about 12 athletes during the game, that's about 1 million lines for 20 minutes. And for soccer player, the game duration is a bit longer. That's about 6 million lines of code, like 6 million lines of data that you're capturing for the 90-minute game. And that's just the games. Imagine, just think about the practices three times a day, to about an hour and a half to 2 hours that we're capturing those data. So that's a lot of data that we're funneling through. Okay. We also collect, and from these GPS data, we're measuring heart rate, your basic, your heart rate, accelerometer, gyroscopes, the GPS heading, the altitude, the longitudinal, latitude positioning of these players. And from there, we can calculate the speed, the acceleration of the players, the player load, or different distance that they run at different intensities. So these are all the metrics that you can find that's been generated by this catapult system that we're using. The other data that we also collect is just a whole host of different performance data. We're talking about like our strength data, which are like 1 rep max, or on squats, bench press, or cleans. Our speed, which are 40-meter max sprints. We do a lot of mile tests, like mile runs, or even we've tried critical speed or critical power tests. We do some neuromuscular testings and physiological testings like VO2 or lactate. And these metrics are what we use in the model layer to calibrate, to predict their performance. We also have tactical and technical data, and that's where we're getting that from your video. So we videotape every session, practice session and games, and we code different tactics, such as turnovers, or when we score, when we make a try, when we have breakdowns, or just different technical variables that the team is interested in. We we code them. And also your generic game stats that we get from the organizers, from organizers. We have medical data. We're looking at injury rates, depending on what kind. We're trying to look at like different how much training load an athletes can handle before they either get injured or when they cannot train at a regular training session, so we had to modify the training because of that. So we track that, and we also look at nutritional data. We looked at, primarily we're looking at like energy expenditures. Based on the VO2 data that we have, VO2 tests, and the GPS data, we can estimate, or we can quantify their energy expenditure during the game, during the session, pretty accurately that way. Lastly, but not least, we monitor their wellness. So these are just a bunch of questionnaires that the athletes answer about half an hour after they wake up. And the questions relates to their sleep quantity, how many hours do they sleep through the night, the quality of the sleep. We asked about how their muscle pain from previous days of training, muscle soreness, motivation, how they think their training is progressing. So these are just some of the data that we collect from the athletes, and this is just a quick screenshot of what the coaches see in the morning before they go out. So you can see that here are the training loads. We have the acute training loads where it varies, daily. Looking at and acute training loads are just training load over the last week. The average of the training load over the last week. We have the chronic training load, looking at what's the long-term training load pattern. Right. So this is for the team. We have these the different modality of training and how much time we're spent at different modality that of training sessions. And this is obviously the pie chart of what different training sessions are. Over the different training session, over the percentage of the different training sessions on the entire training load. here are all the different questionnaires that we asked. These are just all these little fine lines here are just the different patterns of the the answers to these different questionnaires, and the thick line here is just the overall score, and the overall score here we have are just the sum of all the individual questions. So for training load, we can quantify them externally, and with us, what we have here is using speed, or from that we get from the GPS data or acceleration, so we can quantify the external load, and similarly in cycling, you can quantify that with power meters, like the power data that you get from the power meters. We can also quantify them internally. You've heard about the TRIMPs and the sessional rate of perceived effort training loads. The catapult system, the GPS system we have, provides us with also the player load, which is calculated based on their heart rate, at different zones. However, so this is another snapshot of their training loads for each individual. So these are all these individual athletes looking at different training load that they experienced during that training sessions. So this is another thing that the coaches will monitor in the morning to just to make sure that the athletes are all within their prescribed training workout zones. However, as we know that in rugby, there are multi-sports or multi-modes of training. So we do a lot of, let's say, conditioning games, weight training sessions, speed sessions, skill sessions, aerobic training. So we need some ways to better quantify all that different type of training. And one way we can do that is with a method called the T2-minute method, which essentially, again, like what Phil mentioned before, that we can put weighting factors on these different exercises. So this is a paper published for rowing, where they put in weighting factors for different cross-training or different exercises that they do for rowing. We have indoor rowing ergometers. You have on-water rowing, which is used as the reference. So all the other training modality is based off of that reference of rowing on the water. They also put in weighting factors on intensity. And all these different intensities were defined by the physiological tests of lactate tests. So they have training, intensity 1 is at lactate threshold, just below lactate threshold. 2 is between lactate threshold, the lower half of lactate threshold, 1 and 2. You have the upper half. So this is how they define the different training zones, and so they allocate different weighting factors, where the weighting factors are, again, not a linear weighting factor. It's an exponential weighting factor, since we know that as you perform an intensity at a much higher intensity, it's just a lot more taxing on your body, okay, and on your system. So that's the calculation of it. It's just essentially just the weighting factors of the training mode, the exercise, multiplied by the intensity, and then multiplied by the duration that you spent at that intensity. And you just sum out all the different training zones, different times, the intensities that you spend at different zones. So we can adapt that same principle to rugby, where the athletes report their training session as an RPE, so rating of perceived effort, and we can apply weighting factors to each RPE. And similarly for different training sessions where we have conditioning games and modified conditioning or conditioning sessions are most related to the rugby motion, right? So they're used as a reference, and everything else will be based, will be calibrated towards the reference. So to the rugby girls, a lot of times, like when they do cross training, when they do an hour run, to them, because they're so used to doing a lot of short intermittent exercises, an hour run to them is dreadful. They don't like to do long runs, and so that to them that they feel a lot more taxed after the hour steady state runs, as to compare to just doing an hour of just similar effort interval works, right? So that's why the weighting factor is a bit higher on that. So these are different weighting factors for the training modes. So similarly, for the training load calculation, you'll just multiply the different training intensity weighting factors with the exercise weighting factors by the duration of the exercise. And so once you are able to quantify the training load accurately, next then we're looking into now how do we model? What can we do to model this, to use this input to trying to predict some sort of outcome that that we're interested in. And Phil has explained it really well about this Bannister model that we're using, where again that messy equation over there is just, think of it just like the fitness component, where you have this is the time decay and this is the gain. These are similarly for fatigue, you can quantify with that component, that formula over there. And these are all the different, these four parameters is what we're trying to estimate for each individual athlete. Okay? And those are very individualized to the response of the athletes. And essentially you can look at this whole messy equation. Again, you can boil it down to a very simple equation of just fitness minus fatigue equals performance. Okay? And so that's what that's the Bannister model that we use for our model for the athletes. And as for the performance, for our metrics that we're interested in, we use so in order to try to minimize the extra work that we want to try to extra testings or extra work from the practitioners, let's say for example the coaches or strength and conditioning coaches, and I try to. So what I did was I tried to capture the maximum speed that these athletes would do during a week session. My reasoning is that during a week of training, since we're capturing all their GPS data on every session that they're training, at some point in the 15 to 20 training sessions, we're gonna bound to capture their max speed somehow. Like we've got to look at it. There's one of these sessions either in their skills or their speed sessions or their conditioning game or scrimmages that we'll be able to capture these individuals like max speed. So that's what I did. I try to. That's one of the metrics that I use to try to use that as our to try to calibrate that model. However, we looked at other testings that the athletes do every twice a week. That we have them come and do some box jump, because it's just something that's simple and that doesn't really take that much out of them, doing just a drop jump. So it's just like about they stand on top of a box that's about a foot high, and they just hop off. And we looked at how quickly they jump off the ground, so that's the ground contact time. We looked at the height that the maximum height that they get to, and we looked at what's called the reactive strength index, which is just the ground contact time divided by height. Okay, so these are all the metrics that we looked at. We also looked at different physiological testing. So we looked at critical speed, which we can quantify their aerobic and anaerobic components. So we primarily use the aerobic components, which is that we use it as our metrics. And the other test that we do a lot is also their 40-meter max sprint. And from there, we can also model the profile of their sprint, and we can get their theoretical force, peak force, or their theoretical max speed, horizontal speed. We can look at their rate of time, rate to reach max speed or reach max power. We can calculate all that. And these are all metrics that we could use as our performance metrics to predict their, performance. So instead of looking at, instead of showing you guys all the things that we're looking at, I just want to, look at the max speed that we're getting from the GPS data. First, we'll just, I want to show you just like individually how does the model, what the model shows. So this is max speed captured weekly. So we're looking at, we're just capturing the max speed weekly. And you can see that there's a lot of variance in their max speed, right, for all these different individuals. And so what I found was that there's sort of like two types of patterns to the model. Because of the variance, there's such a high variance, you either don't, the model just shows, trying to find, basically, essentially they can't. So either one, you see these models just chases every single point, it becomes that you're chasing the noise, right? Second of all, or you see another pattern where it doesn't chase the noise, but it just finds sort of an average, and it just doesn't really reflect doesn't really capture the predict the performance as well. So these are the two patterns I found when you start using the maximum speed, capturing their maximum speed weekly. So these are the different training loads. These are the training loads for that individual from during the 6-month period. So what I did next was instead of so I thought, okay, so if you're capturing speed weekly and it gives you a whole bunch of very huge variance, what happens if we just maybe instead of doing weekly, we'll just do it bi-weekly? We'll just do it every 2 weeks, capture the max speed every 2 weeks, and you can see that it's a lot better. It models the individual's response a lot closer when you start, when you spread out the testing a little bit more. And that is actually true when we look at the data from the box jump data in their ground contact time or even with their height. Because for those data, we do those testings twice a week on Mondays and Fridays. And so again, when you throw that into the model, it chases the noise quite a bit. There's quite a lot of variance. So the model is essentially just like a whole bunch of jagged lines. And so it's really hard to interpret that. And so instead, I did the same thing. I just took 1 out of every 4 instead of two testings a week. I just took data from just once every 2 weeks. And again, that showed a lot more higher correlation to the performance test. Okay, so we can do this for the entire team as well. And what I did is now for the training. So these are all the individual training load. We can, for the entire team, you can take an average of each training session for the entire team. And similarly for the max speed, I took the average of the entire training sessions of the max speed of all the individuals, and I modeled it that way. And so you can see that it works relatively well for, I actually, so I want to go back and look at, so you can see so I want to point out some of the points that you can see are sort of way off from the model prediction. And which this is kind of interesting is that a lot of these points that are way off where you're supposed to get, this predicts that this point should be, this person should be doing quite well during a performance test. Meanwhile, you can see this person actually performed quite poorly. And a lot of that is because that really coincides with the menstrual cycle and even to sickness, right? So which is kind of, that's exactly what you want to see, is that this points out, as when as you get sick, or if you're in, these are women's rugby players, when you're on, in your cycle, your performance is gonna drop, right? So that's that to us was interesting, that so we can right away know that, okay, that there's some discrepancy, and it's not because of the model, it's actually because there's something else going on, and then that sort of alarms you to maybe now you should look into the wellness data and not be too alarmed. Oh, no, the performance is low because there's something, that you got to be a little bit careful looking at the other components of the our data to just make sure that everything lines up. Okay. Looking at the team data, we can see that it models pretty good. And so what can we do in terms of this team data once we can model them? As Phil pointed out before, we can look at the tapering of once we can know the response of the team, and so we can do simulations. This is, at this point here, this is where the actual time, like the actual training load that we're capturing. If we know that in about a month out from now, that's our tournament date, we can simulate training load in there. We can put in whatever training load that we want, in hope to see a response, to see an improved response in whatever metrics that you're looking at. So in this case, I'm looking at speed, so you can simulate whatever, some type of training stimulus, so that you can make sure that you're, in a month out, during your big game day, that you're at its peak or some much higher peak speed. And once you have the simulation stress planned out, then you can prescribe your training more. You can have more directed planning on your training prescription. Okay, so that's something that we're doing with the in terms of like training monitoring, performance monitoring for the rugby team. And this model is not without limitations, right? Training load, we can more and more accurately quantify that. We can look at within maybe revisit the weighting factors, right? We can look at like within even the training sessions. For example, looking at better quantify that by looking like, let's say, weight sessions. Right now, if it's like 90 minutes, let's say weight sessions at an RPE of 5. Are you actually, is that 90 minutes actually, are you really actually working out the whole entire 90 seconds, 90 minutes, or are you actually, really only working for 10 minutes of that time, and then most of the other times are just like, resting, recovering. So better training session quantification. And more, I guess incorporating, like I was saying before, incorporating the sickness and the menstruation cycle into the models to better capture that. Because right now, if you're sick and you're not training, in the model, it actually thinks that you are tapering because your training load is much lower. And so it's actually thinking that you're actually tapering, and so it predicts that your performance is actually going to increase, but however, we know that's not true, right? Like you're just like trying to recover from your sickness. For performance, we're, because they do tests at different times, they don't consistently do the same test all the time, and so ideally, we want to try to standardize, find a way to standardize that they, have a different standardized way to use all the results and trying to incorporate all these different tests into the model, so that we don't just use, wait for too long to use the same type of tests for the model. So that's that's the end of my talk on our team performance predictions. Yeah, thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. So before I begin, I just want to disclose that I do some work as an independent consultant for some of the device companies that I will present data using their devices today. So in some sense, I think my talk is very, very different than both Phil and Ming's talks, but yet there are synergies, and we do face similar challenges in quantifying physical activity and physical behavior in the clinical research and healthcare settings. So I'm going to start my talk by providing just a little bit of background to set the stage and to kind of establish the context of what I mean when I talk about physical behavior and physical activity. And then I'll move on to the bulk of my talk, which is going to focus mostly on the how. So how do we translate output from these wearable sensors into metrics that are meaningful in the health and health care space? So what exactly am I going to talk about when I talk about physical behavior? So physical behavior in my work is, in general, all of the behaviors that a person performs within their 24-hour day. So these behaviors can be broadly categorized into upright activities, sedentary behaviors, and sleeping. And these can be further broken down into a lot of different categories, and I apologize for the font obviously not displaying appropriately up here. But they can be broken down into a number of different categories. Up here I have stepping activities, standing activities, sitting, and lying. And then each of these primary behaviors have important attributes that are associated with them. And so in general, we're interested in the frequency in which these behaviors are performed, the intensity at which these behaviors are performed, the type of behaviors that are performed, as well as the duration that they're performed. And if we think about measuring these behaviors and these behavior attributes over time, we think about a person's habitual behavior profile. And so specifically, when we talk about measuring physical behavior in this context, we're interested in identifying posture or activity type, and this can be broken down again into more specific activity types. And we're also interested in measuring these attributes of these behavior types. So again, the frequency, intensity, and duration that they're performed. And as a field, we're just starting to kind of jump into this measuring and estimating sleep timing and duration. So when I say sleep timing, I mean what time did someone go to bed, what time did they wake up in the morning, and what was their total sleep duration. So why? I mean, this is pretty obvious, but an individual's habitual behavior profile has specific physiological attributes that are associated with it. And when these are performed over time, their habitual physical behavior is strongly related to chronic disease incidence, morbidity, mortality, as well as risk factors for essentially all chronic diseases. And so this is obviously a great interest for clinical researchers, clinicians trying to get their patients to change their behavior, or behavior interventionists just trying to get individuals to change their behavior. And these tools can be used to measure exposure so that researchers can study the association between different physical behaviors and disease incidence. They can be used to measure outcomes. So if a patient undergoes a knee replacement surgery and a clinician is interested in knowing how that surgery impacted their behavior, did they become more active after the surgery or less active? And then also to measure important covariates in research studies. So a lot of clinical drug trials are beginning to use wearable sensors and wearable devices to measure behavior if they're interested, in the side effects of their drug, which obviously they should be, and if a drug potentially has an impact on musculoskeletal health, they need to know and be able to control for changes in activity and behavior. So when and where? Well, really simply put, we're essentially interested in measuring everything, everywhere, all of the time, which is quite different than in the sports performance field because, Ming alluded to the 6 million lines of data for a 90-minute soccer game. We're looking at, measuring behavior 24/7 for weeks to months at a time, and if we have 100 hertz data, that's a lot of data to deal with. So this is a challenge both logistically dealing with the data and processing the data, but also in terms of adherence. How do we get people to wear these sensors all of the time? So I'm now going to move on to the how of the presentation. So how do we translate output from these wearable sensors? And I'm mostly going to focus on accelerometers here because this traditionally has been the tool of choice in my field, and it appears to be the tool of choice moving forward as well. But I'm going to start by giving a little historical perspective, talking about the first activity monitors that were used. And I'll move on to kind of the established approaches, which I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the cut point method that we use in the health research space. And then move on to some more sophisticated approaches using machine learning techniques and an integrated acceleration signal. Move on to using machine learning with raw acceleration signals. And then talk a little bit about developing these methods in a laboratory versus in a free living setting. And then talk about some interesting points moving forward in terms of integrating data from different sensors or multiple sensors, and also the need for point-and-click solutions for applied clinicians and researchers. So believe it or not, monitoring activity dates way back to the 1st century. It said that Vitruvius was the first inventor of an activity monitor. This device obviously was not worn. You can see the pictures down here, and it was essentially a cart that someone pushed, and it measured miles traveled. And he was interested in doing this to track basically military movement around the countryside. And Leonardo da Vinci was credited with inventing the first pedometer. So obviously these types of tools date way back. Luckily, we've had some advancements since then. So modern day activity monitors are generally in the form of wearable sensors, and they may look similar to the devices shown here. So this participant down here has a number of accelerometers and pedometers on a belt, as well as a device on his thigh and his wrist. The device up here is a wearable direct calorimeter, so it uses a small heat flow gauge to measure heat flux from the body and to estimate energy expenditure that way. And so in general, when we talk about wearable sensors, they're generally a device that measures something about physiology or something about movement. So it's either a physiologic sensor like a heart rate monitor, or a heat flux sensor and skin temperature, or a kinematic sensor like a pedometer or an accelerometer. And again, for this talk, I'm mostly focusing on the use of accelerometers. So this slide shows a number of different devices that are currently used. It's a bit outdated, actually, and so these kind of have evolved over the years, and there are many, many more devices that are out there. But some of the more popular ones are the actigraph accelerometer, which is shown down here. And then we have other devices that can be worn on the foot. This is a combined heart rate and accelerometer sensor. So the actigraph is arguably the most commonly used device in clinical research, and this just shows the evolution of the device over time. So in general, the device has gone from being very large to relatively small, and the storage capacity, battery life, and computational power has all increased over time. So the current device, or the most recent device, is called the GT9X Link, and it has 4 gigabytes of memory. It collects raw accelerations for weeks to months at a time, and it also has an IMU with a gyroscope and a magnetometer and additional accelerometers. So some of the early work using accelerometers, this paper was published in 1982, and I put this up here just to, read a little excerpt from their abstract where they say, with the activity monitors, it may be possible to develop an understanding of the role of moderate levels of physical activity to health on a population basis, since moderate levels of physical activity can be more accurately classified. Furthermore, the change in activity over time probably could be assessed more precisely, especially in relationship to change in other cardiovascular risk factors such as HDLC, blood pressure, and weight. The instrument could also be used to evaluate changes in activity, such as part of a clinical trial designed to increase physical activity levels following a heart attack. Lastly, this objective measure could also be employed as a feedback mechanism to inform individuals how active they really are. And so the point of me reading this is that this was way back in 1982. No one had really ever used these devices in clinical research or healthcare applications. There were no consumer wearables. There were no Fitbits. There were no, Apple iWatches and all those things. But yet our goals back then and now remain very similar. We've developed a lot of different methodologies over the years, but the goals are still similar. And so this paper by Henry Montoy was published the year after in 1983. And this was some of the first work to basically just show that output from accelerometers first on the, go back. So on the left, output from accelerometers is extremely reliable. So these data just show repeated trials, and the correlation between the repeated trials is 0.94. On the right over here, we have the relationship between accelerometer output and VO2, so oxygen consumption. And you can see a quite nice linear relationship here. If we fast forward to 1998, Friedson and colleagues were among the first physical activity researchers and exercise scientists to use accelerometers kind of in the way that we're used to today. And so this study was a small calibration study with 50 college-age students. They performed 2 walking speeds and 1 running speed on the treadmill. And this figure shows the nice linear relationship between accelerometer output and energy expenditure, which is expressed as METs here. And so from these data, Friedson and colleagues also developed count cut points, which essentially allow you to classify an activity into an intensity category. So is the activity being performed sedentary, light, moderate, or vigorous? And so this figure here shows accelerometer output over an individual's waking day, with accelerometer output on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And so again, using the count cut point method, the idea here is that we identify these thresholds, and any time the output exceeds that threshold, that minute is classified as sedentary, light, moderate, or vigorous intensity activity. And at the end of the day, in the end of the measurement period, we can summarize these into daily values, so we'll have an estimated, time in moderate to vigorous physical activity per day. And so this method was pretty straightforward, easy to understand, easy for applied researchers to take and use in their own research, whatever that may be. And so as a result, these methods are still being widely used today, even though it was developed back in 1998. And even though we have identified numerous limitations with these methods, and we've also advanced the analytics, the process accelerometers considerably since then, but these are kind of the go-to methods that people revert back to. Some of the limitations that were recognized with linear regression in the cut point method is, number one, the relationship between accelerometer output and energy expenditure is not linear. These data show accelerometer output on the x-axis and energy expenditure as METs on the y-axis. These data are from a calibration study. And across the range of activity types and intensity, you can see that there's a different relationship between energy expenditure and accelerometer output. So first of all, a linear shape is never going to fit all of these data perfectly. And secondly, there's a different relationship for different types of activities. A second limitation about linear regression and count cut point method is that when we average accelerometer output over a minute, we generally ignore rich information in the acceleration signal. So for example, these two figures on the left shows inclined walking on a treadmill and tennis on the right. When we use the linear regression count cut point method, we average these signals and essentially get an average output per minute. The average output per minute for inclined walking is very similar to the average output per minute for tennis. These are very different activities with very different energy expenditures, but yet this method will essentially ignore all this rich information and give us a very simplified look at the data. So as a field, measurement scientists began to think about moving beyond traditional linear regression count cut point methods. They took a stab at developing multiple regression approaches where an activity would be sent to one regression if it was above a certain intensity threshold, and one regression if it was below a certain intensity threshold, or if it was a locomotion activity versus a lifestyle activity, and vice versa. Other approaches included using multiple sensors, so putting sensors on different parts of the body and integrating the data that way, and also incorporating heart rate sensors into the equation. But these approaches, you know, as I mentioned before, we're interested in measuring physical behavior 24 hours a day for weeks and months at a time, and when you start to add multiple sensors to an individual, and you start to think about dealing with those data logistically, the trade-offs, you know, are very debatable. So this is about the time where, as a field, we began to think about using more complex analytical approaches to process the accelerometer data. And the idea was that we needed a statistical method that could access more information from the signal. There's obviously lots of information in that signal that we weren't using. And we needed a flexible modeling technique that didn't try to just take a shape, a predetermined shape like a linear regression, and fit it to complex data. And so as a field, we began to jump into this machine learning approach. And this table here is quite messy, and I don't expect you to be able to see it, but it's from a 2010 review. And the point here is just that there are a lot of researchers working on these more advanced data processing techniques. And so machine learning, you know, there's a lot of different models. Some of the more commonly used ones in the physical activity field are artificial neural networks, hidden Markov modeling, decision tree analysis, random forest, support vector machines, and I could go on. But the general idea with machine learning approaches is that they're adaptive modeling techniques that can take data and learn the shape of the data. They're very flexible, so again, we don't try to take a simple shape like a line, a linear regression, and fit it to complex data. Machine learning can take on very much more complex shapes. It takes the data, learns the shape of the data, and then it determines its shape from the data. So John Stoudemire and colleagues were among the first folks to do some work with machine learning in the physical activity field. And they developed two artificial neural networks to estimate energy expenditure expressed as METs and to identify activity type. They did this in a lab setting where they trained the two models on over 400 participants that performed a wide range of sporting, lifestyle, and locomotion activities. They used two inputs into both artificial neural networks. The first input they used was a statistic called the lag-1 autocorrelation, which essentially tells us a little bit about the temporal dynamics of the signal. So an autocorrelation can range in values from -1 to 1, and essentially it tests the relationship between adjacent observations within the same variable. The second input that they found important was the frequency distribution of a minute's worth of accelerometer output. So they summarized the minute's worth of accelerometer output into the 10th, 25th, 50th, 75th, and 90th percentiles. And the reason why this input they found was so powerful was that implicitly included in this statistic are other common statistics like the mean, the standard deviation, and coefficient of variation. So they are able to develop two neural networks using two relatively simple inputs. So this figure shows, actual METs on the x-axis compared to estimated METs from the artificial neural network on the y-axis. The neural network is shown in the filled circles here, and you can see that across all of the activity types and intensities, it falls very close to the line of identity. And on average, the estimated METs from the artificial neural network, or the error, I'm sorry, from the artificial neural network was much smaller than 3 previously published and commonly used regression approaches. The figure on the right here shows the percentage of minutes correctly identified by the artificial neural network. And so the scale here, this is at 70% here. So this isn't 0, just to orient you. On average, the artificial neural network correctly classified activity type 88.8% of the time. And several subjects you can see up here actually had 100% accuracy. So this was pretty good. They were pretty excited. You know, this, again, was one of the first stabs at using machine learning in this context. And so the next step was to test this model in free-living participants. And this table is not very illustrative, but these are results from the free-living validation. And in general, the performance of the neural network declined considerably. So if we looked at estimating time spent in each of the intensity categories, I'll just highlight here that the average error for time in moderate to vigorous physical activity was over 70%. So 70% of the time we were wrong when we were trying to estimate time in moderate to vigorous physical activity. So as a field, people began to show this, that, you know, we develop these methods and these powerful models in a lab setting, but then when we take them into the free living, their performance essentially plummets. In this paper, principal component analysis was used to identify activity type, and these top pictures are a confusion matrix from a lab setting where overall accuracy was about 96%. And then these plots show the clustering of different activity types. And you can see that the colors essentially cluster together, and there's little overlap between the different colors. But then when this model was tested in the free living, its performance declined considerably down to about 76%. And if we look at the clustering of the behaviors, you can see that the overlap of the colors is considerably. And essentially the take-home message here is that if the different activity types are overlapping each other, we're never going to be able to distinguish or identify these activity types correctly. And so just a little bit on laboratory calibrations and how these models are developed. Essentially what happens is a participant will come into the lab, they'll put on accelerometers, you can see them right here on this person's belt, they'll wear an indirect calorimetry system, and they'll perform a range of activities. They generally are performed, locomotion activities are performed on a treadmill, and then they'll perform a variety of lifestyle or household or activities of daily living. And these are usually predetermined activities that are performed for a predetermined amount of time, where a participant will do something for, say, 5 minutes at a time, they'll stop, they'll rest for 3 minutes, and then perform the next activity of interest. So there's a very clear distinguishment between different activity types. But this is problematic when we try to move into the free living, because in the free living, you know, there's no activity routines. Behaviors don't start and stop on the minute. There's just kind of, you know, an endless array of activities that can be performed. And each minute of behavior, and if we have, you know, 2 hours of accelerometer data, within that, each minute of that accelerometer data can contain many different activities. In a lab, we're pretty certain that each minute of activity or each minute of output only contains one specific activity. And so researchers recognize this challenge in moving beyond laboratory calibrations. And so to just illustrate this here, we have 2 minutes and 30 seconds of accelerometer output. The activities identified in the box above are from direct observation. So these are the activities that were being performed at this time. And if we use methods developed in the lab, we blindly just chop up these data into minute intervals. And this becomes problematic, again, when we move to the free living and activities don't start and stop on the minute. So ideally, what we would like to be able to do in the free living is identify where these behaviors start and stop, and then estimate the metrics that we're interested in for a specific behavior. And so Stoudemire and, just want to point this out here. So the other challenge is that when activities are performed in the lab versus in the free living, they often look very different. So even if, we can be sure that in the free living behaviors start and stop on the minute, this figure here shows a 3.5 mile an hour walk on a treadmill compared to a self-paced walk outdoors and a self-paced walk indoors. And the point is they look very different. So if we use these data to create a model and then try to apply it to these data, again, it's not, surprising that our performance declines considerably. So Stoudemire and colleagues recognized these limitations, and they adapted their neural networks to be applied in the free living. And so they did a free living calibration study where they collected data on people in the free living, and they developed a combined approach using artificial neural networks and decision trees. And the way that it worked was that they first identified where activity bouts started and stopped, and then they identified these bouts as either an activity or an inactivity. If they identified it as an inactivity, it was assigned an energy expenditure or MET value based off of the compendium of physical activities. And if it was identified as an activity, then they used the artificial neural network to estimate METs or energy expenditure that way. And so in general, this approach improved the performance of their laboratory model. These figures show the mean bias or the mean error for the model developed in the lab, which is shown in the square, and the model developed in the free living, which is in the dot. And you can see it cut the error in half for time in sedentary and light, and then considerably improved the performance for estimating time in moderate to vigorous physical activity, as well as total net hours per day. And it also performed much better than traditional common used regression approaches that, again, are still commonly being used by a lot of applied researchers. And so moving forward, I identified four major areas that researchers are currently and appear to be the future of measurement research. And so the first one is taking these calibration studies and developing these models in free living settings as opposed to laboratory settings. And then also taking high resolution raw acceleration data from these devices and developing models using much more information. The third challenge or area is, measuring these behaviors again over the 24-hour activity cycle. How do we, get people to wear devices 24 hours a day? How do we measure essentially everything that they're doing? And then where does sleep fit in? Again, sleep is an important, physiological concept that physical activity researchers have essentially ignored for the past 20 years and are now starting to realize that it may actually be important. So we're starting to develop models and methods to more accurately measure sleep. And then point and click solutions. These machine learning models have great potential, but they're more difficult to understand, they're more difficult to apply. Researchers are looking for these methods that they are easily deployable. They can take, devices, give them to their participants, get the devices back, plug it into a computer, point and click, get their outcomes. And these machine learning models are not nicely packaged into any solutions like that just yet. So just to touch on the free living calibration and validation studies and the challenges with that. So a couple of groups are currently doing this, but the problem is that it's very burdensome to both the researcher and the participant. What is our criterion in the free living? You can't have somebody wear an indirect calorimeter throughout their whole day at home and at work and at school and those sorts of things. So some methods that people have started to use are The first method is referred to as user annotated data. So essentially the person will carry around their iPhone and record in an app or something. They'll get pings to say, record what you're doing right at this second, and they'll have to go in and fill out certain descriptions about what it is that they're doing at that exact moment. Another method is direct observation. So this is similar to the user annotated data, except for the researcher follows the person around in their free living and essentially records every time the person changes their behavior. This is obviously somewhat burdensome to a researcher. And so this is a picture of what that might look like. This is a researcher following a participant around, recording their behavior. So they'll have a screen here to identify the activity type, and then a screen here to write down what they estimate their energy expenditure to be at that point. And then another approach is using wearable cameras. So this device is called the Sense Cam, and it's worn around the neck. And it takes pictures at random from a first-person perspective. And then this is less burdensome at the time, but then can you imagine as a researcher getting all these pictures and having to go back through someone's day and essentially put meaning to them? So this is also very burdensome. And so raw acceleration signals. So really simply, the Sojourn method, the method that took the neural network developed in the lab and then adapted it for the free living, that improved the performance, but that method still continued to use an integrated accelerometer signal. Obviously, if we use, data sampled at 100 hertz or even 30 hertz, we're going to get more information from the signal. And these are just examples of what an integrated signal might look like compared to a raw acceleration signal for that same activity. And same thing for stairs over here. And so there's a group at the University of California, San Diego that's doing a lot of work with using raw acceleration signals and developing machine learning approaches. In this study, they used 3-axis acceleration at both the hip and the wrist, sampled at 30 hertz. And they tested a random forest classifier to identify activity type and estimate energy expenditure. They used a 45-dimensional feature vector of time and frequency domain statistics. You'll remember from the Sojourn method that was developed using the integrated signal, there were just two very simple features that were used as an input. So this obviously is gathering much more information from the acceleration signal. These data are Bland-Altman plots from the performance of estimating energy expenditure using the accelerometer at the wrist versus the accelerometer at the hip. And they performed reasonably well. On average, the random forest classifier using information from the wrist had an error of about 1.09 METs compared to the hip was about 1. And then they added in measurements of heart rate combined with accelerometry, as well as accelerometers at both the wrist and the hip. And you can see the errors here are much smaller when they combine multiple sensors and the heart rate data. Especially when they combined, an accelerometer at the wrist, at the hip, and the heart rate measurement, the error was very small on average. But again, if our goal is to monitor people 24 hours a day for weeks to months at a time, every time we add another sensor, our chances of participant adherence declines. And so this figure shows the F-scores for identifying the different activity types for the random forest classifier. And in this instance, adding the additional sensors and adding the heart rate measurement did not improve performance considerably. And so 24-hour activity cycle, sleep, where does sleep fit in? So again, this is kind of a new area for physical activity researchers and physical activity measurement scientists. It's pretty obvious that as the entire world is getting more sedentary, less active, and there's also, been a huge increase in chronic disease. But what's less known is that there's also been a consistent considerable decline in sleep over the years. And part of this is because there hasn't been a good way to measure this at a population level. And part of this is because it just hasn't gotten that much attention in terms of, risk for chronic disease. But recently, there's been a lot more focus on it as sleep deficiency and sleep disruption, continue to be thought of as risk factors for weight gain, obesity, type 2 diabetes. It's thought to alter, appetite regulating hormones, disrupt energy balance, inflammation, glucose tolerance, insulin sensitivity, essentially all the risk factors that you could think of for diabetes, heart disease, all the common chronic diseases. And so we did some work where we tried to use a single accelerometer placed on the thigh to estimate lying time from sitting time, and while lying is not sleeping, it could be used as a surrogate measure for it. And using just one sensor on the thigh and a simple 65-degree threshold for angular rotation of the thigh, we were able to pretty accurately distinguish lying from sitting. So the specificity of this algorithm was almost 97%. I'm sorry, the specificity was almost 97%, and this is the sensitivity was about 93%. And so moving beyond this, like I said, lying is not sleep. But this is a picture of what the 3-axis acceleration signal looks like on the thigh during night while lying, and during daytime wake, and then again during night. And it's obvious, even without zooming in on these data, that there's a clear difference between lying and wake times. And so we aim to use a simple random forest design using simple input statistics of mean, standard deviation, and the frequency distribution to estimate daytime waking periods, to estimate sleep, and to estimate wake after sleep onset. So we didn't want to just identify lying. We wanted to know, yes, they're lying here, but are they sleeping or are they awake? And using a small sample, we've had moderate success at the beginning. This is the confusion matrix here, and you can see that for sleep, our prediction accuracy was about 85%, not bad. For daytime wake, it was a little bit higher. What we're not good at yet is identifying wake after sleep onset. So after someone goes to bed, if they do wake up and they're awake for a couple minutes here and there throughout the night, can we estimate that? And we're not very good at that at this point in time. So moving on to point-and-click solutions. So as I said before, some of these modeling techniques are pretty sophisticated, and it makes applied researchers want to have nothing to do with them. So it's important that we kind of nicely package these methods into nice packages for them to use. This is an example of data from the ActivePal, which is worn on the thigh. And this software nicely takes data from each of the days that the participant was wearing it. So each line here is a day. The blue represents lying, the yellow is sitting, the green is standing, and the red is stepping. The different shades of yellow, the darker the yellow gets, means it was a longer continuous sitting bout. And so this method just nicely gives you a picture of what the whole day, these participants' whole measurement period looked like, from the time they started wearing the device on Tuesday to the time they stopped wearing it on Monday. Did they go to bed around the similar time? Did they wake up around the similar time? Did they perform their activity bouts at the same time on each day? So this is just an example of kind of, I think, the power of data visualization and providing people with these tools where we'd like to move as a field. So in summary, moving into this machine learning kind of approach, it improves our estimation of energy expenditure and activity type identification. But most of these approaches have mostly been developed in laboratory settings where activity routines are very controlled. And so they've yet to realize their potential in free living settings. It's difficult to identify transitions between activity bouts in the free living, and features from free living activities are likely very different than the features that you would get from the same activity performed in a laboratory setting. And so several studies have performed these free living calibration studies, and they do improve performance, but again, the burden of performing these is relatively high. Higher sampling frequencies and multiple axes will provide us with more information that can be used to help improve our models moving forward. And we'll continue as a field to focus on advances in sleep measurement. Again, going back to the point-and-click solutions here, researchers want an easy-to-use method that we can nicely package up and give to them. And so that's also a focus of what's coming next. Yep, and as the machine learning approaches become more complex, the less user-friendly they're going to become. So we need to keep that in mind as a field, I think, too, moving forward. So finally, I think that because these approaches are going to require, so many different areas of expertise, we need, software analytics, we need kinesiologists and health professionals that understand what it is that's important to measure. We need engineering to get these devices to be, low profile and easy to wear for 24 hours at a time, to be able to wear at night. And we need behavioral scientists that understand, what it is that's important to change, and what it is that's important to get out of these devices. So, thank you.